Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. Alleged interactions with extraterrestrial craft and their occupants come in many forms, each providing varying degrees of evidence with which to validate their provenance. Only a small number of these cases have led to serious illness or injury, and there is no clear explanation for how or why the people involved got sick or hurt. This week, we examined two such instances of close encounters of the second kind. In 1972, famed ufologists J. Allen Hynek created a system that would put alleged extraterrestrial encounters into different groups. In recent decades, this system has been expanded to include every possible type of scenario, but at the time of its inception, there were only three classifications. The first type of encounter, which was the lowest level of the Hynek system, was defined as a distant sighting of what was thought to be an alien ship. On the other hand, the highest categories of third-kind encounters were decided by how people interacted with the people on these ships. But in between these two extremes lay a wide middle ground in which the craft identities involved left some form of physical evidence of their passing without directly interacting with any human being. These were classified as close encounters of the second kind. Examples of the evidence left behind at such incidents have included lasting damage being caused to vegetation and buildings, documented interference with electronics and other telecommunication systems, and in the most extreme cases, death or serious injury being inflicted upon humans or animals. These kinds of things don't happen very often, and we've already talked about some of the saddest ones in previous episodes. These incidents have also provoked a disturbing debate amongst commentators on the subject as to whether the harm caused to those involved is deliberate on the part of these visitors or merely an unfortunate byproduct of their presence. What is clear is that close proximity to alleged extraterrestrial craft and their occupants has proven time and time again to be extremely dangerous, with unseen and powerful forces exerted during these incidents, forces which can lead to long-term injuries and lasting health implications for those who are lucky enough or perhaps unlucky enough to have witnessed such an event. It's about 9 o'clock at night. On the evening of the 29th of December 1980, drivers traveling along the Texas State Road 1485 would likely have seen an Oldsmobile Cutlass slowly laboring along the highway towards the city of Dayton. The car's owner, Betty Cash, had been returning home from a dinner with her longtime friend Vicki Landrum, along with Vicki's 7-year-old grandson Colby. The two women were in good spirits and were happily chatting away as the car proceeded to enter a heavily wooded section of the road. Shortly after this, Landrum told her friend that she could see a brightly lit object high above the trees moving through the woods in front of them. As Cash slowed down, she also saw it. After a short conversation, the two women agreed that what they had seen was probably an airplane trying to find Houston International Airport, which was close by. A little further along the highway, Cash suddenly became aware of an intense light up ahead which was illuminating the carriageway. "I thought it must be a truck coming up behind me with its lights still on full beam." She instinctively slowed down her own car, but then she saw that the light ahead didn't seem to be getting brighter or dimmer. As the car came to a stop around a blind turn, Cash could see that a large craft was hovering a few feet above the ground and partially blocking the road ahead. She would later go on to describe it as roughly the same size as the top of the water tower, being metallic in appearance and shaped like a diamond, with the tips cut off at the top and bottom. The central portion of this vessel was surrounded by a ring of blue lights, and every so often a series of intense flames would issue forth from the base of the object. When they did so, the craft would immediately coast forwards a few feet towards the car and then come to a halt until the next burst would then propel it forwards again. As she surveyed this mysterious floating object, Cash's first instinct was to turn the car around and drive back the way she came, but at the same time she was conscious that it had been raining heavily that day, and the ground either side of the road was muddy, leading her to fret that she may become stuck. It was at this point during the incident that Landrum commented about how hot she was feeling. Cash suddenly realized that the temperature inside the car seemed to have been steadily going up since the first time they saw the thing. Landrum, a long-standing and devout Christian, told her friend that she believed what they were witnessing was some form of religious visitation and stated that she wanted to get out of the vehicle. But as she went to do so, she stopped herself. Colby was getting visibly angry and upset in the back seats behind them, which they could see. Cash, on the other hand, did get out of the car and start walking slowly toward the mysterious floating craft. She was quickly stopped in her tracks by how hot it was, and she had to go back to the car. When she did so, she found that the door handle was now too hot to touch. When she got back into her car, she would have to wrap the sleeve of her coat around her hand in order to open the door. Cash then watched on in amazement as Landrum proceeded to place her outstretched palm on the vinyl of the dashboard. Now, the material was so hot that her hands seemed to sink into it. When she took them off, she left a permanent mark, which they are still looking at with complete confusion. The object gave off another huge flame burst and then slowly rose into the air until it was above the treetops. Then, the two women heard another noise as a group of big military helicopters flew quickly overhead. Interview. After the interview, the strange ship took off, with army helicopters following it through the forest. The two women watched on for a time as the lights receded into the distance before carrying on with their journey, talking animatedly about what they had just witnessed. Later that evening, after she had dropped Vicky and Colby back home, Betty Cash suddenly collapsed in her kitchen and began to vomit. During the rest of that night, she kept getting violently sick and also got very sick and had diarrhea. The following morning, she made a phone call to Landrum, who immediately admitted that she too was experiencing similar symptoms as was Colby. Over the next few days, the condition of the two women would continue to steadily deteriorate. They both got weak and found it hard to pay attention to anything. Cash's skin started to blister in a painful way, like when you get a bad sunburn. When she finally went to the hospital to get checked out, doctors there noticed that small pieces of her hair were starting to fall out. A radiologist who looked at the patients said that their symptoms were similar to those of people who had been exposed to high levels of ionizing radiation, but in most of those cases, the people who had been exposed to high levels of radiation had died soon after. Instead, both women would get better, but they would have health problems for the rest of their lives. Betty Cash was taken to the hospital once a year for the next 18 years until she died. She had been diagnosed with breast cancer right after the alleged UFO sighting and had been fighting it for a long time. For her part, Vicky Landrum developed severe cataracts in both eyes, a condition that would impair her vision until her eventual death in 2007. Much like his grandmother, Colby was significantly less affected than Betty Cash, and he managed to escape the incident without developing any long-term health implications. In the years which have passed since the Cash Landrum sighting, there has been great speculation as to what could have caused the illnesses sustained by both witnesses. Some people think that in addition to low-level radiation, the women may have been exposed to something with an infrared property and possibly even an aerosol or gas. The most common theory is that Cash was more affected than her passengers because she temporarily gave up what little protection her car offered. This happened 30 years before the incident with Betty Cash and Vicky Landrum, and an even scarier event is said to have happened in a rural area not far from the outskirts of Buenos Aires. The primary witness of this incident would be a Venezuelan physician by the name of Enrique Bota, who before qualifying as a doctor had originally mastered a degree in engineering. It was his credentials in this field which had resulted in him being invited to Argentina during the summer of 1950 in order to work on a rural engineering project. One morning he was driving the rental car from his hotel along the remote highway towards the isolated rural area of Bahia Blanca where he had been working. Due to the early hour, there was no other traffic on the road, and so he had easily spotted what on approach appeared to be a car overturned in the field. But as Butter got closer to the crashed car, he saw that it didn't have any windows or doors that he could see. Instead, it looked like a flat piece of metal. After stopping a short distance away, he watched for a few minutes before getting out of his car to get a closer look. As he drove around the strange vehicle, he saw a hole in its side, which he used to get inside. It was difficult for him to see anything as there was only one blinking red light attached to the roof of the hole, but slowly as Butter's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, he realized that he was not alone. On one side, there was a large control panel of some kind with different gauges and meters that the engineer had never seen before. 3 metal seats with small figures strapped into them were set up around this strange console. The doctor said that the people inside the ship were about 4 feet tall and wore some kind of tight-fitting grey coveralls. He called out to the figures, but they didn't answer. He moved closer to try to wake them up. Voto would later recall that. As he shuffled around towards the chairs, he ran his hand along the interior of the disc and was amazed to find that it had the texture of rubber, despite being apparently metallic in appearance. Then he shook the shoulder of one of the beings who was sitting down. The skin beneath his fingers felt solid, and almost charred in texture. At this point, Butter ran away from the object because he thought the people inside had died in the apparent crash. He drove straight back to the hotel and told Horatio and Leo what he had seen. "Thank you." The 3 men got their guns ready and drove back to the place where the machine had been. Instead of the machine, they found a mysterious pile of dark ash. When one of the men picked up some of this ash in his hand, the skin on his hand slowly turned purple and stayed that way for the next 3 days. As the men began to spread out and walk around the vicinity of the ash pile, they suddenly caught sight of a series of strange red lights approaching in the distant sky. Losing their nerve, the men ran back to their car and made off as fast as they could, taking a couple of blurry photos of the flying lights as they did so. Just as with the Cash Landrum sighting in the days following the event, Enrique Butter's skin began to severely blister on his face. The imprint of where he had been wearing his sunglasses on the day of the incident remained seared into the skin, and did not fade away for many weeks when he was subsequently bedridden with severe fever-like symptoms which had gone on to overwhelm him. Boto was finally rushed to hospital. Doctors carried out a battery of tests on him, concerned that he had succumbed to a form of radiation poisoning. And yet, there was no sign of this at all. During the testing, which lasted for a few years, neither of the 3 men allowed themselves to speak about the incident until Butter was finally persuaded to attend a UFO conference where he opened up about the experience there to fellow delegates. This would lead him to commit his memories of what had happened to paper in a book he titled Situation Red. Concerning other similarities between these 2 events and the life-threatening symptoms that showed up in the people involved. These symptoms are also found in many of the stories of people who say they have been visited by aliens. This radiation-like poisoning could be a side effect of a scanning device that the alien ship is using, or it could be a byproduct of the ship's propulsion system or fuel source. Another idea is that the atmosphere where the entities usually live is harmful to humans, so they have to make it the same in their craft and in the area around them. Then it ends up being dangerous for the witnesses they meet. Thankfully, most alleged UFO sightings are still close encounters of the first kind, but since there are so many UFO stories in the news right now, it's always possible that these visitors will decide to make direct contact with humans one day. Perhaps such cases should be taken as cautionary tales.